Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful Gossips 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Following Electra's shocking death that month, nothing in Los Angeles felt the same anymore. Especially for Will Spencer, who had always believed that life, even in a town built on secrets, betrayals, and second chances, still followed some kind of invisible order. Electra's death didn't just shake the people who loved her. It cracked something open in Will that he didn't know how to fix. The world kept moving. Cars still filled the streets. Meetings still happened at Forrester Creations. Brooke and Ridge still circled each other like they always had. But for Will, time stalled at the moment he heard the news. It came in the quietest way possible. A phone call that didn't sound urgent at first, just heavy, as if the person on the other end already knew that words wouldn't be enough. Electra was gone. Just like that. No warning, no dramatic buildup, no chance to say goodbye. 1 minute she was a living, breathing presence in his life, complicated and imperfect and full of unfinished conversations, and the next she was a memory people spoke about in hushed tones, careful not to say the wrong thing. Will tried to stay. First he really did. He told himself that leaving town would look like running away, and Spencers weren't supposed to run. They stood their ground. They faced consequences. They dealt with the messes their lives created. But Electra's death wasn't a mess he knew how to clean up. Everywhere he went there were reminders, places they'd laughed, places they'd argued, places where she'd challenged him to be better than he was. Even the beach felt different, the sound of the waves no longer calming but relentless, like they were asking questions he couldn't answer. Nights became the worst part. Sleep didn't come easily. And when it did, it brought dreams that left him more exhausted than before. He'd wake up convinced he'd heard her voice, or that if he reached out, she'd be there, rolling her eyes at him for being dramatic. But the bed stayed empty, and the silence always won. People noticed the change in him long before he admitted it to himself. Bill, for all his flaws and hard edges, saw it in his son's eyes. The dullness, the way Will listened without really hearing. The way his temper flared over small things because the big thing was too painful to touch. Bill tried his version of comfort, which mostly sounded like advice and warnings and reminders that life doesn't stop just because you're hurting. Liam tried too in his own gentler way, reminding Will that grief didn't mean he was alone, that the family was still there. But sometimes family made it harder, not easier. They represented continuity, a future that kept unfolding whether Will felt ready or not. And he didn't. Not even close. Electra's funeral was the moment everything finally broke. Will stood there surrounded by familiar faces, listening to words about love, loss, and remembrance, and all he could think about was how wrong it felt that this was the end of her story. No more chances. No more what if. No more apologies that came too late. When it was over, when people began drifting away in small groups, exchanging sympathetic glances and promising to check in, Will stayed behind, staring at the ground as if it might offer him some explanation. That was when he realized the truth he'd been avoiding. Staying in Los Angeles meant reliving this moment over and over again. Every street, every building, every familiar face carried too much weight. The decision to leave didn't happen all at once. It crept up on him in quiet moments, packing away something that reminded him of Electra, deleting a voicemail he couldn't bring himself to listen to again, staring out at the city lights and feeling nothing but exhaustion. When he finally said the words out loud, they surprised even him. I think I need to go. Not forever. He didn't frame it that way. Just away. Somewhere that didn't know him as a Spencer. Somewhere Electra wasn't part of every conversation, every memory, every expectation. Bill didn't take it well at first. He argued, accused Will of giving up, of letting grief make decisions for him. But underneath the anger was fear, the kind that comes from watching your child slip out of reach. The goodbye conversations were harder than Will expected. Each one felt like peeling off another layer of skin. Liam tried to be supportive, even when it hurt, reminding Will that sometimes leaving was the bravest thing a person could do. Katie hugged him longer than usual, whispering that he deserved peace, even if it took him far away from home to find it. And then there were the people who didn't know what to say at all, who offered awkward smiles and vague well wishes that only emphasized how alone grief could feel. Will didn't blame them. He barely knew what to say to himself. The night before he left, We'll walk through the city one last time, letting memories surface without fighting them. Electra laughing at something stupid he'd said. Electra calling him out when he tried to avoid difficult truths. Electra believing in him even when he didn't. He realized then that leaving wasn't about forgetting her. It was about learning how to live with her absence without being destroyed by it. Los Angeles had given him too much too fast. Love, loss, identity, expectation. And he needed distance to sort through what was real and what was just noise. When Will finally drove out of town, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light over a city that had shaped him in ways he was only beginning to understand. He didn't know where he was going yet, only that he couldn't stay. The road ahead felt uncertain, even frightening, but for the first time since Electra's death, it also felt honest. Leaving didn't mean he loved her any less. It meant he loved himself enough to admit he was hurting. And as Los Angeles disappeared in his rearview mirror, Will carried Electra with him. Not as a ghost haunting every step, but as a part of his story that would always matter, no matter where life took him next. After Will left Los Angeles, the silence he thought he wanted didn't arrive the way he expected. There was no sudden peace, no magical relief that came from putting miles between himself and the city that had taken so much from him. Instead, there was a strange emptiness that followed him wherever he went, settling in like a shadow that didn't care about geography. He drove for hours that first day, stopping only when exhaustion forced him to pull over, the radio low, the road stretching endlessly ahead. Every mile felt like both an escape and a betrayal. Escape from the constant reminders of Electra. Betrayal because leaving meant admitting he couldn't survive where she had lived and died. He told himself it was temporary, that this wasn't some dramatic goodbye forever. But deep down Will knew this was more than a break. It was a fracture. The first town he stayed in was small, quiet, the kind of place where no one looked twice at him and no one knew the Spencer name. He checked into a modest motel with faded curtains and a humming air conditioner that never quite cooled the room. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't impressive. But it was anonymous, and that felt like a gift. For the first time in years, he didn't have expectations placed on him before he even opened his mouth. He didn't have to be Bill Spencer's son or Liam's brother or the guy everyone assumed would bounce back because Spencer's always did. He was just Will. And some days even that felt like too much. Grief didn't follow a schedule. Some mornings Will woke up feeling almost normal. Like maybe the worst had passed and life might find a new rhythm. Other days he couldn't get out of bed. The smallest things triggered memories, someone laughing in a diner, a woman walking by wearing the same perfume Electra used to wear, a song playing overhead that transported him back to a moment he'd thought he'd forgotten. He started writing things down not because he thought it would help, but because the thoughts had nowhere else to go. Pages filled with half-finished sentences, questions he couldn't answer, anger he didn't know how to express. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't linear. But it was honest, and honesty was something his life in Los Angeles rarely allowed. Back in Los Angeles, Will's absence didn't go unnoticed. Bill felt it the most even if he didn't say it out loud. The Spencer house felt quieter, heavier, like something essential had been removed and no one knew how to replace it. Bill threw himself into work, into deals and power plays and distractions that had always been his armor. But even he couldn't outrun the truth forever. Losing Electra had broken something in Will, and Bill couldn't shake the guilt that came with wondering if he'd failed his son by teaching him how to be strong but not how to be vulnerable. Liam tried to bridge the gap, calling Will whenever he could, leaving messages when Will didn't answer. Sometimes Will picked up, sometimes he didn't. And Liam learned to accept that silence didn't always mean rejection. It sometimes meant survival. Electra's name still came up in conversations, though people were careful, cautious, as if saying it too often might reopen wounds that never fully closed. For some, she became a cautionary tale. For others, a tragic memory. But for Will, she was still alive in ways no one else could see. She existed in the decisions he now hesitated over, in the way he questioned his own impulses, in the growing awareness that life could change in a single, irreversible moment. Leaving town hadn't erased that truth. If anything, it had sharpened it. Weeks passed. Then months. Will found a temporary job at a small marina, doing work that was physical and straightforward. No politics, no legacy attached. The labor grounded him in a way he hadn't expected. There was something comforting about exhaustion that came from effort rather than emotion. The people he worked with didn't pry. They accepted him as he was: quiet, distant, competent. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Will began to breathe a little easier. Not because the pain was gone, but because it wasn't consuming every second anymore. One evening after a long day, Will sat by the water watching the sun sink below the horizon. The sky shifted through colors Electra would have loved, and instead of turning away, Will let himself look. He let the sadness come without trying to fight it. He talked to her then, not out loud but in that internal space grief creates. He told her about the place, about the people, about how strange it felt to exist in a world where she didn't. And for the first time since her death, he didn't feel like he was breaking. He felt like he was remembering. Back in Los Angeles, life kept unfolding in its usual dramatic fashion. Relationships strained and mended, secrets surfaced, alliances shifted. But beneath all of it was the quiet awareness that something had changed. Will Spencer leaving town wasn't just a storyline. It was a ripple effect. His absence forced people to confront their own losses, their own unfinished business. For Bill, it meant acknowledging that control had limits. For Liam, it meant recognizing that strength didn't always look like staying. For everyone who had loved Electra in some way, it meant accepting that grief didn't follow the rules of daytime drama. It lingered, evolved, reshaped lives. Will didn't know when, or if, he'd return to Los Angeles. Some nights he imagined it, walking back into familiar spaces with a version of himself that felt steadier, wiser, more intact. Other nights he couldn't picture it at all. And for now that uncertainty was okay. Healing, he was learning, wasn't about closure or moving on. It was about moving forward without pretending the past didn't matter. Electra's death would always be part of him. Leaving town didn't change that. But distance gave him room to carry that loss without being crushed by it. And wherever the road eventually led, back home or somewhere entirely new, Will knew one thing for certain. He wasn't running anymore. He was rebuilding. And sometimes that was the bravest story of all. Time didn't heal Will Spencer the way people always promised it would. What time did instead was teach him how to function with the wound still open. He learned which mornings were easier and which ones required more effort just to get out of bed. He learned that grief didn't shrink. It shifted. Some days it sat quietly in the background, a dull ache he could ignore long enough to get through work. Other days it surged without warning, knocking the air out of his lungs with memories he hadn't invited. But he stopped fighting it. Fighting had exhausted him. Acceptance, even imperfect acceptance, felt more sustainable. The marina became routine. The salt in the air, the steady rhythm of work, the uncomplicated nature of the job, it grounded him. There were no boardrooms, no whispered power plays, no people trying to figure out what he wanted so they could use it. He showed up, did the work, went home. Simple. Honest. Some of the guys he worked with started inviting him out after hours. He declined at first, unsure how to explain that laughter still felt like betrayal. But eventually he said yes. Not because he was ready, but because isolation had begun to feel heavier than the risk of connection. One night, sitting at a worn wooden table in a small bar near the docks, Will realized something that surprised him. For the first time since Electra's death, he wasn't thinking about how wrong it felt to be alive without her. He was listening, really listening to someone else's story. A coworker talking about a failed marriage. Another joking about a kid who refused to listen. Ordinary pain. Ordinary life. And it struck Will that grief didn't make him separate from the world. It connected him to it. Everyone was carrying something. His loss wasn't unique in its existence, only in its shape. Los Angeles, meanwhile, continued to pulse with drama, ambition, and unresolved emotion. Bill Spencer pretended his son's absence didn't affect him, but the cracks showed in quiet moments. He lingered longer in rooms Will used to occupy. He caught himself reaching for his phone, only to stop short, unsure whether to call or give his son space. Bill wasn't good at that kind of uncertainty. It made him restless, vulnerable. And vulnerability was a language he'd spent his entire life refusing to learn. Liam noticed it too. He watched his father spiral between overwork and silence, and it stirred something uncomfortable inside him. Liam had always believed in talking things through, in emotional transparency, but even he struggled to find the right words when it came to Will. How do you tell someone that you miss them without making them feel guilty for leaving? How do you support someone's healing when it hurts you that they're gone? So Liam did what he could. He checked in. He listened when Will called. He respected the pauses in between. Electra's presence lingered in Los Angeles in quieter ways. Not through dramatic flashbacks or grand memorials, but through subtle absences. The empty chair at a table. The silence after a joke that used to make her laugh. The awareness that someone should be there but wasn't. People moved forward because that's what life demanded, but no one forgot. Not really. Will didn't return for the holidays. That decision weighed heavily on him. He knew what it would mean to Bill, to Liam, to the rest of the family. But the idea of sitting in familiar rooms, surrounded by traditions that now felt hollow, was more than he could handle. Instead, he spent the day working a double shift, grateful for the distraction. That night, alone in his small apartment, he finally let himself cry the way he hadn't since the funeral. Not quietly. Not politely. Just honestly. And when it passed, he felt lighter, not healed but less trapped. Something began to change after that. Slowly. Subtly. Will started thinking about the future in ways he hadn't allowed himself to before. Not in terms of grand plans or ambitions but possibilities. What if this wasn't just an escape? What if it was a beginning? The thought scared him more than staying broken ever had. Hope required courage. Grief at least was familiar. One afternoon, Will received a message from someone he hadn't expected. An old acquaintance from Los Angeles who had heard he'd left town. The message was simple. No pressure. Just acknowledgement. And it reminded Will that he hadn't disappeared. He had just stepped out of the spotlight. That distinction mattered more than he realized. Back home, Bill finally did something unexpected. He stopped chasing. He didn't push. He didn't lecture. Instead, he wrote Will a letter. Not an email. Not a text. A letter. In it, he didn't offer advice or solutions. He admitted fear. Regret. Love. He told his son that leaving hadn't made him weaker in Bill's eyes. It had made him human. And for a man like Bill Spencer, that admission meant more than any speech ever could. When Will received the letter, he read it 3 times. Then he sat with it. He didn't respond right away. He didn't need to. For the first time, he felt understood without being asked to explain himself. That was new. That was healing in its own way. As months passed, Will realized he was no longer just surviving his grief. He was integrating it. Electra wasn't something he had to escape from. She was something he carried. Her influence showed up in the way he spoke more carefully, listened more deeply, reacted less impulsively. Loss had reshaped him, but it hadn't hollowed him out. It had carved space for empathy, for patience, for growth. The idea of returning to Los Angeles no longer felt impossible. Didn't feel urgent either. It simply existed as an option. And that was enough for now. Will wasn't running anymore. He wasn't hiding. He was living quietly, deliberately, imperfectly. And wherever the next chapter took him, back home or somewhere new, Will Spencer knew one thing with certainty. Electra's death had changed his life, but it hadn't ended it. The story was still unfolding. Slower now. Deeper. And more real than anything he'd known before. Will's decision to leave town sent shockwaves through the Forrester and Spencer families alike. It wasn't just the grief over Electra's tragic and sudden death. It was the way he carried himself in the days that followed, distant and withdrawn, almost as if the weight of everything that had happened was too much for anyone to bear. Liam tried reaching out, but Will's silence was impenetrable. Hope, ever sensitive to the emotional currents around her, attempted to bridge the gap, offering support, hugs and quiet conversations, but Will only nodded, his eyes reflecting a storm of emotions he couldn't yet name. The house felt emptier than ever. Bill, still reeling from the dual tragedies of losing Electra and watching his grandson walk away, struggled with guilt and helplessness. Every family dinner, every holiday gathering seemed hollow without Will's voice filling the room with laughter or his teasing comments sparking playful arguments. Conversations that once revolved around ordinary family drama, romances, business ventures and teenage squabbles, now carried an undercurrent of tension and unspoken sorrow. In the midst of it all, Ridge, Brooke, and the extended Forrester family tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, throwing themselves into work at Forrester Creations. Yet, even the creative energy that usually filled the halls of the fashion house felt muted. Every sketch, every runway show, every new collection carried whispers of Electra's absence and Will's departure. The staff, loyal and empathetic, tried to hold the pieces together, but the heart of the family, the connections that made every struggle and triumph meaningful, was fractured. As Will drove away, the skyline of Los Angeles fading behind him, he carried not only grief but also a determination to find himself outside the shadow of tragedy. Somewhere in the distance, the possibility of healing awaited, though the road ahead was uncertain, lonely, and filled with bittersweet memories of a life he once knew so intimately. And so the story of loss, resilience, and the quiet hope of new beginnings lingered in the hearts of those left behind, leaving fans of the bold and the beautiful holding their breath, wondering what would come next.